The Vikings began landing at high tide. From his position, Brian could see the foreigners climbing out of their longships and splashing through the shallows. Some of those vessels could carry from 80 to 100 men. But Brian did not try to calculate the number of invaders. It did not matter. All that mattered was the courage of his own men and how well they followed orders. On the 23rd of April 1014, the valley of the Tolka became a killing field. Morgan Llewellyn, 1014, Brian Boru, and the Battle for Ireland. The Battle of Clontarf occurred on April 23, 1014, near the modern-day Dublin suburb of Clontarf. It was a significant military clash involving the predominantly Irish army with a peppering of Hiberno Norse mercenaries commanded by High King Brian Boru, and the coalition formed by the Irish Kingdom of Leinster, the Hiberno Scandinavian city-state of Dublin, and Vikings from the Kingdom of the Isles as far away as Orkney, up in the north of Scotland. The battle resulted in a substantial loss of life, between 5,000 to 10,000 warriors, surpassing the casualties in typical conflicts of that time. Although Brian's army won the day, the High King and most of his sons were killed, and the momentum he had built in changing Ireland pretty much stopped. But the Norse expansion of influence, invasions, power in Ireland also ceased, providing a pyrrhic victory for Brian, his Dalcassians, and for the land of Ireland itself. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD was one of the most significant battles in Irish history, which happened just over 50 years before the famous Battle of Hastings in England. Under the leadership of Brian Boru, the Irish successfully defeated a coalition of Hiberno Norse invading Vikings and Irish rebels who opposed the new High King's rule and wanted to expand Norse control of Ireland beyond the port cities. Revisionists and downplayers of the significance of this battle have somewhat successfully written off what the struggle was really about due to the complex nature of the affair. It was a battle for Ireland, as Morgan Llewellyn put it in her book, 1014, Brian Boru and the Battle for Ireland. This battle for Ireland reached its climax through the Battle of Clontarf, in which the High King Brian Boru and most of his sons lost their lives in victory. Brian's career, as I will flesh out in detail, will present to you that a plan had been underway from the mid-late 970s AD onwards to incorporate Viking power into the Gaelic forces and unite the entire island under one banner, including the long-settled and thriving Viking and Hiberno Norse port cities. The build-up and complicated web and years of more minor battles with an overturning of the status quo in the stale High Kingship of the Neils led up to this very point. I believe Brian Boru and his army saved Ireland from a different fate, which would have included a much different and oppressive force of Viking rule, which would have expanded from their control of the city-state of Dublin, throughout the country. And it isn't a popular narrative to view the Irish as an unbelievable force to be reckoned with in those times, because on the land of what is now called England, not Scotland or Wales, but England, were conquered by Romans, Vikings and Normans. And we held off until the Normans, a feat that is hard to fathom by the populist narrative, usually made up of a Romano-British psychology, language and viewpoint. Ultimately, the battle for Ireland was a battle fought for many generations, which peaked in 1014. And that is what my argument is. I will delve deep into the beginning of Boru's career and move forward right until the Battle of Clontarf. I will also include some counter-arguments to the mix towards the end. In the decades leading up to the Battle of Clontarf, Conflicts and resistance efforts set the stage for this pivotal event. Brian Boru and the Dalcassians had been in a prolonged struggle against the Vikings, who had occupied a settlement known as Limerick. According to two sources, Ivar of Limerick and his sons caused lots of destruction to the province of Mumu, Munster, where Brian's family's kingdom was based. There came after that an immensely great fleet, more wonderful than all the other fleets, for its equal and its likeness never came before to Ireland. With Ivar, grandson of Ivar, king chief of the foreigners, with his three sons, Duvken, and Cuala, and Aralt, sons of Ivar. These landed and encamped in Inishsibtund, in the harbour of Limnach. Mumu was plundered and ravaged on all sides by them, both churches and chieftainries, and they levied pledges and hostages from all the men of Mumun, both Gal and Gehil, and they afterwards brought them under indescribable oppression and servitude to the foreigners and the Danes. Cogug Gael Rigal, the War of the Irish with the Foreigners. The book CGG, as we'll just abbreviate for the moment, is a propaganda piece, but the Vikings of Limnach did plunder, ravage and destroy many settlements and ruin many families over the years since its inception. Even Boru's family suffered at the hands of these opportunists. The Dalcassian kingdom was based on the River Shannon, which provided easy access for the Limerick Vikings. And it is probably something the new Dalcassian power brothers would not forget and leave unpunished. Brian, son of Canada, Brian Boru, has organised his guerrilla bands in the mountains of Clare. He is determined to avenge the rape of his homeland, and like Alfred of Wessex, nearly a century before, to keep at least his own corner of the island free from Scandinavian domination. From Brian Boru, King of Ireland, Roger Chatterton Newman. Brian fought battles alongside his brother Mahon, then either King of Thomond or potentially King of Munster. They achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Sulcoit against the Vikings of Limerick, led by Ivar, whose allies were Gaelic clans, mainly of the Oanachta and the Viginti. Still, the focus lay on Ivar and Limerick. This battle would mimic the Battle of Clontarf in some sense, because the murmurings and ideas of Ivar's plan were to ultimately try and take the kingship of Munster and expand Norse control. But Mahon stopped that, with Brian Boru as his commander of the army. In the annals of Inishfallen, a defeat of the foreigners of Limerick by Mahon, son of Connecticut, at Sulcoit, and Limerick was burnt by him before noon on the following day. Sometime after, rival clans treacherously murdered Mahon in a coalition with Ivar of Limerick. As the new king of Thomond, Brian did not waste time and took revenge on Ivar and his sons, who were sheltering on Scattery Island in the estuary of the River Shannon and the Atlantic Ocean. They were dispatched, and later the Dalcassian king confronted his remaining Gaelic rivals in the province, and a descendant of Ivar in the Battle of Ballach Lachta. It would prove to be a decisive victory that catapulted Brian Boru to be the new king of Munster. The last of three pivotal battles in Brian's early career was the Battle of Cahercuan, which saw the very last remaining Gaelic rivals of Donovan and potentially one other son of Ivar, Aralt, defeated and killed by Brian and the Dalcassians, now becoming the undisputed new power in Munster. Replacing the Oanach at the throne of Cashel, Brian Boru brought about a swift change of political life in Ireland. This was the first significant movement in his career, and certainly wouldn't be the last. Ireland was stagnant politically, and needed fresh thinking and innovation. The O'Neills held a high kingship for 600 years, without ever stopping the Viking invaders from setting up shop in the southern half of Ireland. The weaknesses were paramount in the south, and Brian capitalised on them when the timing was right. The smaller Dal Cash, Boru's family in Tua, kingdom proved to have surprising military might and displaced the increasingly beset Oanachta, who were suffering also from attacks by the Vikings and the Aeneals on the Munster throne during the course of the 10th century. Wikipedia. With Brian taking the mantle of the King of Munster, work had to be done. A revolutionary new viewpoint unfolded in Brian's dealings with the established Viking ports, Limnock and Waterford. In subduing Limnock, he did not simply destroy and replace. He left the very wealthy Norse, Hiberno-Norse traders and families in the city, and incorporated the power of the city Longfort into his own fleet and manpower. Brian is often slighted and accused of using Viking mercenaries in his army, which is really short-sighted. The Vikings were already established within these fortresses that were started about 100 years before his birth. All around Ireland, Limnock, Dublin, Waterford, these were the most significant and definitely a focal point for him and his plans. We begin to see that incorporating these city-states into the Gaelic army rather than consistently battling and fighting with them was a really good idea. Brian recognised, even in the midst of vengeance, the need for commercial strongholds and permitted the Danes, they should really be Norse in this case, to remain in the town on payment of an annual tribute of wine. In later years, Danes and Norsemen were to play a prominent role in financing Brian's enlarged kingdom. From Brian Boru, King of Ireland, Roger Chatterton Newman. All of this is called strategy, forward-thinking, entrepreneurial momentum, utilizing what was valuable from the old enemy and using it to your advantage. Think of it like modern day companies buying out smaller companies or old dying businesses. But it keeps the most vital assets and fires the rest. What Brian was doing was exactly this. There was a plan in place. It was a vision for Ireland. Using the technological advances, the new urbanized trading centres and fleets that the Vikings had provided and brought to these shores. This was the beginning of the journey towards a united front under the leadership of a visionary leader and their team. And the next step was Waterford, and it was another Ivar. There was one more Gaelic resistance within the province of Munster, which came under the Fuileán King of Deshi, Mumu, who saw Brian's rise with contempt as a tributary to the King of Munster. Fuileán had promises of backing from the then King of Leinster, Donal mac Lorcan, the Leinster being a neighbouring kingdom to Munster. And potentially Ivar of Waterford was going to get into some sort of alliance with this rebel king. But because of his weak attempt at defeating Brian Boru, this was squashed quickly and effectively. From there, the defeated of this Fuileán retreated to Waterford. And this was the opportunity for Brian's forces to enter the town and subdue Ivar of Waterford, where he met little resistance. Later, he and Brian became strong allies again, cementing a plan to create a new unified force under strong leadership. The vanquished fell back on Waterford, where a final and hopeless stand was made. Brian entered the town, put it to the sword, any who were capable of resistance, and after sacking the fortress, marched northwards to deal with Donal of Leinster. From Brian Boru, King of Ireland, Roger Chatterton Newman. Lots of times I personally hear in the comments section people assuming or presenting an idea of Brian Boru being a belligerent, domineering individual who was just power thirsty. But again, this is such a narrow-minded view and very uneducated. In these times, it was a constant fight for land, power and resources. Like a family business, every king in their tua, their jurisdiction, their family, would have to think of expansion, think of their allies, their competitors and the future. Brian was doing things a little differently, but it wasn't anything really new. It was thinking of your tua, your kingdom, your province's future, and how to move up the ladder of importance and gain your place at the top table This was absolutely paramount in these times and absolutely how things worked. The difference was Brian's pace and power surprised everybody. And this is where he met resistance and formed enemies. But he met every single one of them on the battlefield and won. Power struggles among the ruling classes were a constant. Interludes of warfare were as frequent as the changing in the seasons. Morgan Llewellyn on 10th century Ireland, in 1014 Brian Boru and the Battle for Ireland. Now that the province of Munster with its 2 Viking strongholds were under the control of Brian Boru, it was time to think of Leinster and the Viking stronghold of Dublin. Something to bear in mind here is the positioning of the Viking ports in Munster, with the Viking port of Dublin lying on the border of the southern half of Ireland. With their riches, shipping technology and other resources, all 3 Viking ports could prove very useful for a full-on standing army of Ireland. No doubt this was what Brian had in mind. Why else would he keep these places intact and make alliances when they subdued and submitted to Brian's rule? Granted, he did eliminate Ivar of Limerick, but remember, Ivar of Limerick was a very big cog in the killing of his older brother Mahon, and of the rape and pillage of his lands when he was growing up. After this was done, everything changed with Brian. He would make alliances and would keep certain kings in place. He never actually destroyed kingdoms after that. He didn't take out dynasties of families. Maybe he should have, because a lot of the time he wanted to keep these alliances in place, and he proved that with Ivar of Waterford and will go on to prove this with other kings, which I will talk about soon. Ireland and Scandinavia were more alike at this time than one might think, right down to the board games they loved to play. Both societies were rapidly becoming Christianized. By the end of the 10th century, constant warfare with the Irish had shrunk their dominion down to Dublin and its immediate environs, but the Danish city still had considerable influence. Morgan Llewellyn, 1014, Brian Boru and the Battle for Ireland. Up until the 970s and 980s, the Vikings and their port cities were viewed with great suspicion and hatred by the Irish population due to their continuous raiding and plundering. Even though intermarriages and trade relationships were well established by this point, these nucleus locations always presented challenges to Ireland. When Brian Boru ended their influence as would-be raiders and potential challengers to minor and provincial kings in Munster through the annihilation of Tret and subjugation of Limerick and Waterford, it was now the then new High King of Ireland, Mael Shacknil, Malachy Mór II, turn to put an end to Dublin's dominance over their hinterlands and grab Irish control of the city-state. In 980, Mael Shacknil Malachy II, surnamed Mór the Great, King of Meath, became Emperor High King of Ireland, and in the same year he won a victory over the Danes at the Battle of Tara. Seamus MacManus, The Story of the Irish Race. He uses the word emperor there, and there was only one emperor of the Gael, and that was Brian Boru. Seamus MacManus takes liberties at times. In this case, he certainly did. Malachy defeated Olaf Curran, the Norse king of Dublin. And interestingly, Malachy's half-brother, son of Olaf, Glunrin, took over the city for the next decade. So here we are, a High King of Ireland who was related to a Norse, a Hiberna Norse. And people want to talk about how Brian Boru was working with the Vikings. The High King of Ireland before Brian Boru put his Norse brother in charge of Dublin. Can we see the ridiculousness now of brandishing him with some sort of label that he worked with the Vikings and him alone? It's ridiculous. Here we can see how much the Norse population was integrated with the Irish. The High King of Ireland had a half-brother of Norse ancestry who would now rule Dublin. Much like Brian Boru did in Limerick and Waterford, the city was gutted of its hostages, fighting Norsemen men, and the assets that could benefit them were kept in place. This proves that how Brian Boru incorporated Vikings and their technology, including their trading ports, into their arsenal, was also done by the O'Neills. This was nothing new what Brian was doing, just like him expanding his kingdom. It was absolutely nothing new. It was just out of the ordinary because it hadn't come from the south. The next move that Malachy made in showing this upstart, Brian Boru, after his relatively unsuccessful march into the tiny kingdom of Osrega, was to enter Dalcash territory and cut down their sacred tree where the Dalcassian kings were inaugurated, the Mag Adar. This would prove to be a very bad move, exceptionally bad. These sacred trees were of unbelievable importance. The Dalcassian kings would be inaugurated there, and Brian Boru certainly was inaugurated there. It was a bad move by Malachy. He, Mael Shacknail II, therefore marched south from his base in County Westmeath, or perhaps sailed down the Shannon, and entering Dalcash territory, made for the Mag Adar, the plain west of Tulla in County Clare, in which the Dalcash held their Onach, or assembly. Sean Duffy, Brian Boru, and the Battle of Clontarf. In 983, Brian Boru once again marched into the neighbouring kingdom of Osrega, and took its king hostage and others, claiming his overlordship of the territory. People tend to look at this in isolation and claim it as exceptional because it was domineering or different. It was not. This is how kings at the time established their power and gained more lands and resources for their families and tuas. There was a system in place for hostages so that they were looked after beyond, sometimes beyond their own family members. It was completely normal, these actions. Brian Boru was showing extraordinary ambition, and this was viewed with contempt because the power had always been in the north for at least 600 years. It was disputed that at this point Brian pretty much controlled Leinster too, because it only appears in the annals of Munster, and according to Sean Duffy, it should be stressed that it's not recorded in the other annals, and may by just Munster wishful thinking, but then especially at this early stage in his career, non-Munster sources have a tendency to ignore and play down Brian's achievements, Brian Boru in the Battle of Clontarf. By 1985, it can be argued that Brian Boru was essentially the ruler of the southern half of Ireland, called Le Maga, and the time, with the exception of the north city of Dublin, which lies on the border between the southern half and the northern half, Le Huan. With the advent of this new power, it meant that he and the High King of Ireland at the time would become enemies, and a war was brewing between them. For the next decade, it became a back and forth between the two, with raids into each other's territories, showing dominance, retaliations and plundering. The attacks, especially on the side of Brian Boru, became increasingly ambitious over time, with the balance tipping in his favour. Eventually, a truce was sought after by the High King in 997 AD, and as stated in the Annals of Inishfallen, Brian MacCinetic, with the princes of Munster about him, and Mael Shacknail MacDonald, King of Tara, which means High King, went to Port the Chanach, sorry about the pronunciation there, and they divided Ireland between them into two, basically Le Maga and Le Huan. Le Huan to Mac Shacknail and Le Maga to Brian, and the hostages of the Leinstermen and of the foreigners which Mael Shacknail had were given to Brian. Annals of Inishfallen. This was completely normal when you're dealing with territory and power grabs. Hostages were handed over. This was almost like a formal exchange to say that this king deserves what he has at this particular time. It is clear that Mael Shacknail was exceptionally worried about Boru, as he made great strides. Separating Ireland into two halves wasn't used for centuries. It was a new dawn, and Brian Boru showed the country that his power and strength were worth consideration. The O'Neills had become complacent and ceremonial in the country's ruling through their high kingship, more often than not quarrelling among themselves in the north. A true high kingship should mean ruling the entire country through the provincial kings, but the O'Neills held sway for over 6 centuries and weren't really involved in the south, except in infrequent marriages to kings' daughters, which could prove worthwhile alliances. And when Brian Boru was born, in the same year his older sister Orla was actually married to the then High King of the North, and she was hanged for an apparent infidelity. This was the year Brian Boru was born. Now 56 years later, Brian Boru was King of Lech Maga, the entire southern half of Ireland. For a short time he allied with the High King Mael Shacknail and began dealing with the enemies of their power and of Ireland. These two men, who for so long been at war, were now partners. That was Sean Duffy, Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf. Brian Boru was beginning to get challenges from Dublin itself, with its new king Sitric Silkbeard, son of Olaf Curran, and curiously enough by this point, Brian may have been married to Sitric's mother Gormla, or could potentially have been after their marriage ended. It could have already finished, but she and Brian did have one son named Donnacha. Gormla's brother Mael Morda had become King of Leinster, and a number of tales have some sort of legend by this point, including how Mael Morda was insulted during a game of chess by one of Brian's kin while visiting Kincora, the Dalcassian residence, during Gormla's time being married to Boru. This resentment led him to align with Sitric, and they formed a rebellion against the King of Munster and Lech Maga in 999 AD at the Battle of Clontarf. This story appears in a later timeline in other sources. Nevertheless, at some point, Mael Morda would have been in the court of Brian Boru because of his marriage to Gormla, his sister. So this was really a family affair, this whole thing as well. Sitric and Dublin were a common enemy of Malachy too, so working in their alliance, he and Brian Boru marched on the combined Leinster and Dublin forces, and they battled hard. Heavy casualties accumulated, but in the end the combined forces and strengths of Boru and Malachy was too much, and they won the day. Both Mael Morda and Sitric submitted to both kings, again showing how the system worked. Irish kings were willing to incorporate the power of Norse and Highborner Norse. In hindsight, it may have been wise to kill Sitric and Mael Morda and replace them, because they were raising another rebellion again in time, ultimately leading to the Battle of Clontarf. During this time, because of the location of the battle being so close to Dublin, it is said that Brian camped in the area for an extended period. According to Morgan Llewellyn, Brian remained encamped in Dublin from Christmas through most of February. This gave him an opportunity to familiarise himself with the territory. It was a commander's habit of reconnaissance, which must have been second nature to him by this time. He also would have observed the sea, the darkly turbulent sea that lapped the city walls on the east and dominated the lives and fortunes of its inhabitants. Morgan Llewellyn, 1014, Brian Boru and the Battle for Ireland. A storm was brewing, and the stage was being set. Brian wouldn't finish here. The final push and last 15 years of his life would see unbelievable fortune and almost equal measure of loss. The alliance of Brian and Malachy, which had proved successful at Clontarf, was a fragile one. Since the victory there had been frequent skirmishes between Brian's warriors and those of the High King. The brief truce, which had been their mutual advantage, could not last. Two powerful kings could not share one small island. Morgan Llewellyn, 1014, Brian Boru and the Battle for Ireland. Now Brian controlled all three major Norse settlements, because the Battle of Clontarf was a battle for Dublin, and Brian won with the assistance of Malachy. The balance of power shifted, and Brian became a man and king worthy of ruling the entire island of Ireland. Brian had the power of Connacht, Leinster and Dublin now on his side, and it was inevitable that a forward march into Malachy's territory was on the cards. I just want to ask you a big favour, because you've made it this far. If you could just hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you haven't done already, it would really help. It would help this video. It would help future content. It incentivizes me to continue creating this content for you. Also, if you're feeling very generous and you know somebody that will like this, make sure you share it to them.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the video.
In these times, it is essential to remember you were defined so much by your actions, and Boru acted with unrivaled ambition. If you were seen as weak or a target, you were taken out. You had to show strength and work vigorously. People talk about Brian as if he was doing something unusual. The only thing that was out of the ordinary was the quickness and visionary way he coordinated his forward plan. He was doing exactly what the times called for. It was the time of kings and conquest. The Aeneals rested on their laurels, too busy remembering old days and fighting amongst themselves. Nobody understood unity like Brian did. Hence why he reinstated so many defeated kings once they submitted. He was not a tyrant. If he was, he would have slaughtered Sitric and Maelmorda much earlier. In his mind, it was time for change in Ireland. It was time the 600-year dynasty ended. So Brian invaded Lechuan, the northern half of Ireland. Brian's supremacy throughout Lemhaga is implicit in the breadth of the coalition he now commanded. He led the army of Munster, which was joined by those of Austria and Leinster and the newly subdued foreigners of Dublin. All were marching to war in the service of their new lord, Sean Duffy, Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf. This marked the end of Malachy as High King because Brian walked away uncontested and with the upper hand. In those days, pride ruled, and in a way Brian broke the truce between them. To this day, people talk of Brian as a usurper in an extremely negative way, not understanding the full story. It was clear that the country needed unity, and Brian was the only High King to offer this. It was potentially a little late. In saying all this, by 1002, Malachy submitted to Brian Boru and resigned his High Kingship to him because he was not the man for the job anymore in his clan and kin. By making himself Ardrí High King, Brian had challenged and effectively overthrown the ancient rule of the kingly houses of Tara and Ailach. He almost might be described as a land leaper himself. He certainly was reviled in some quarters as a usurper. Yet in his lifetime he would accomplish more for the whole island of Ireland than the Aeneals kings had done in centuries. Morgan Llewellyn, 1014, Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf. There have been some doubts expressed about this explanation, given Brian's style of engaging in war. If he had found his opponent at a disadvantage, it is most likely he would have taken full advantage of it rather than allowing his enemy the time to even the odds. Also, given the length and intensity of the struggle between Mael Shackneil and Brian, it seems unlikely that the High King would surrender his title without a fight. In any case, it is generally accepted that in 1002 Brian became the new High King of Ireland. Brian Boru, Wikipedia. Brian's High Kingship took on a different modus operandi because he wasn't just going to be a ceremonial High King. He would subjugate the entire Ireland to unite under his command. And he was in his 60s. It was unbelievable, really. The vigour, energy he showed, especially in these harsh times. Many, including Morgan Llewellyn, believed that Brian was foreseeing the potential dangers of other foreign invaders coming to their shores. The squabbling and fighting for ceremonial positions had to end. It was time to unify and solidify as one unit, a tight little empire the Romans couldn't conquer and the Vikings hadn't conquered yet. Brian started expanding his reach by marrying off his daughters to different kings to garner and protect alliances for the future, including Sitric Silkbeard, King of Dublin, and even Malcolm, King of Alba, the future Scotland. Macbeth was potentially Brian Boru's great-grandson. Much of his high kingship was spent in constructing palaces, churches and monasteries, building up the infrastructure and campaigning around Ireland to primarily submit the kings of the north, who were finding it very difficult to accept his overlordship. Not being able to see past their vanities and to the rest of Ireland and beyond, they fought and rebelled occasionally. Brian always in the end submitted them. He was the only High King to put in so much effort. It must have been an unbelievable impact. In 1005, he went to the ecclesiastical centre of Ireland, St. Patrick's Cathedral in Armagh, placing gold on the altar and being written into the records as Emperor of the Gael. This brought feelings of not only was he High King of Ireland, but potentially Emperor of the Gael beyond Irish shores. A nice thought, maybe, a way of trying to manifest into existence, as he was making alliances in Scotland, and it is theorised that he sent fleets of Norse to Scotland as well. Brian even attempted to extend his power beyond the limits of Ireland. In the year 1005, he fitted out a fleet manned by Norsemen from Dublin, Waterford and Wexford, and Irish, and pillaged the shores and levied tribute on the inhabitants of northern and western Britain. Seamus MacManus, The Story of the Irish Race. It seems plausible, especially after marrying a daughter to the King of Scotland, claiming himself as Emperor of the Gael, and having the power of the three Norse fleet centres of Ireland. It could have also aggravated the Vikings of the Hebrides, leading to joining Sihtric and Maelmorda, which we'll get into. Of the troublesome northern lands of Ireland, one king in particular was a genuine brute and blinder of men, Flappertack Neil, a real piece of work who wouldn't lay down. He would have to be submitted 3 more times by Brian Boru. If Brian Boru was such a dictator and usurper, why would he be giving these kings so many chances? He could have easily wiped these guys out, but Flappertack did finally relinquish, and Brian married a daughter to him. There was one final push into an area now known as Donegal for the very last most stubborn Neil clan, the Cenéil Conall. Brian, with all his powers throughout Ireland at his command, even with Flappertack, recently submitted Neil on his side, sent a ground and naval campaign into the most northern lands, something that was just never done before. Great hosting by Brian to Cenéil Conall by both land and sea. Sean Duffy, Brian Boru, and the Battle of Clontarf. Brian received a total submission, and in 1011, Brian had submissions from all kings in Ireland for a brief time. This is the first time this was ever achieved, and it has never been achieved since. It was an unbelievable feat for a man who had only obtained the High Kingship 3 years before. But for one brief season in 1011, there was not a king or a lord of any standing in Ireland who had formally submitted to Brian Boruma, Macnatic of the Dalcash, and never before in the history of Ireland, and almost certainly never again in the history of Ireland, was that the case. Sean Duffy, Brian Boru, and the Battle of Clontarf. For a short time there was peace in Ireland. Still, a rebellious spirit was born in Leinster under the guise of Maelmorda, who supposedly only submitted to Brian Boru grudgingly. According to some sources, the anger between Munster and Leinster never ceased, with infrequent raids from Leinster men on Munster territory. In these times, cows were a particular unit of value, a currency, so stealing cows was like stealing from your bank. According to Morgan Llewellyn and others, to stop all this carry-on and to exert a dominance over Maelmorda and Leinster, Boru began the Boru tribute, which was a long-forgotten tradition where lesser kings had to pay a heavy tribute to their Ardrí, the High King, which was stated in the Book of Rights. Reimposing the Boru tribute brought the rivalry between the two men to a whole new level. Morgan Llewellyn, Brian Boru, and the Battle for Ireland. Whatever the case may be here, the reality was the kings of these times had to act, react, build and fight. There was no way around it. Honour, ego and pride was everything. The Gaels were a fighting people to their detriment, and it is easy to write them off in a petty way because they quote-unquote were constantly fighting, according to some with little else to offer. The build-up to the Battle of Clontarf contained 4 people outside of Brian Boru, and potentially the political manoeuvring of another, but that could be untrue. Were Flappertack Neil, Malachy Mór, Maelmorda and Sihtric Silkbeard, and potentially Gormla, ex-wife of Malachy and Brian, who was probably back behind the walls of Dublin with her son Sihtric Silkbeard from her first marriage to the Old Norse king of Dublin, Olaf Curran, who Malachy had defeated way back when, mentioned earlier on. Malachy were having similar issues that Brian was having with Maelmorda, who, let us not forget, was the brother of Gormla and uncle of Sihtric Silkbeard. It does seem evident that they were cooking up some plans to get Boru, as all of them felt hurt by the High King for various reasons. Flappertack was sensing weakness from the Kingdom of Meath, which led to some conflict but nothing full scale, Malachy sought help from Boru, and this led to a campaign into Connacht and into Leinster to subdue both Flappertack again and Maelmorda, and they would meet again near Dublin in 1013 AD. It is pretty well thematic that he was a man who wanted to unify the clans and tried to incorporate all the power into one force. Yes, king, unless it was for the ultimate force in the country. What was the point of a high ordri, high king, if not for the greater good of the entire country under one leadership? And it seemed others just could not see it this way. They just could not see the goal. And in the end, whatever the exact reasoning was, as it is unclear, there was a full revolt issued by Leinster and Dublin forces. This led to Brian's army setting up camp near the city in 1013 for an extended period. From studying the sources, Brian likely planned to put the city under severe pressure as it led into the whole winter, and he stayed there for over 3 months. If Dublin, under the leadership of Sihtric Silkbeard, submitted by sending hostages and making peace with Brian, then he would accept. Here is why we can see Brian unlike a dictator or any other derogatory label that people can muster. Because if wouldn't he just burn the city out, kill everyone and get on with it? He didn't. He retreated once he realised they weren't going to submit to him. Clontarf would be next. These rebel kings would meet Brian in battle. At this point, were the Vikings of the Kingdom of the Isles contacted? Maybe. They were definitely contacted at some point because they would arrive at the Battle of Clontarf to support Maelmorda and Sihtric Silkbeard. To not call it an invasion is naive. To call it simply a battle for Dublin is understating the matter. It was a battle for Ireland, for they wanted to kill the High King of Ireland. They wanted to take over and to take more power. That's what this was all about. Ever since Ireland was first inhabited, this is no different. Sihtric and Maelmorda were only too aware that it would not be long before Brian had collected a greater army and was investing Dublin with his all vigour. District, with his uncle's support, turned overseas for help, first contacting Sigurd, Norse ruler of the Orkneys, and promising him the throne of Ireland and Gormla's hand in marriage if he would lend him his support. Roger Chatterton Newman, Brian Boru, King of Ireland. Sihtric and Maelmorda did not relinquish, so Brian had no choice but to organise his army again. Little did he know about the number of Viking mercenaries arriving in Dublin Bay in Easter week 1014. But as we will discuss, Brian gathered some fighting battalions from Scotland. So the word was out that the Kingdom of Man and the Isles Viking mercenaries were planning an invasion on the side of Sihtric and Maelmorda. The 3rd Division was built around the Connacht men led by Taig, King of the Emean and the Princes of the West. This battalion was supported by the noble Scots, the ancestors of the Royal Stuarts, and the Gael of Alba would fight for Ireland that day. Morgan Llewellyn and Brian Boru in the battle for Ireland. Also Brodir and his brother Osbach of Man were among the fray. It is unclear what they may have been offered, undoubtedly get a chunk of power available from the vacuum left by Brian's demise. Some led that Osbach turned on his brother and joined Brian's army due to his view of the greatest legend. Nevertheless, brought battalions of men on their fleets. It is hard to know sure how many boats arrived, but most certainly at least 1,000 or 2,000 warriors at a minimum pouring onto the shores in their somewhat superior fighting armour. According to the YouTube video Which Clans Fought at the Battle of Clontarf, which relies on many sources I've used for writing this essay, and many more details on how the clans and many clans of Ireland and some of Scotland's arrived for the battle, on Brian's side. It is quite possible that clans and warriors from at least 2/3 of the whole island of Ireland fought with Brian, bar some from the northern lands and North Connacht, showing the strength of Brian and his reign at the time. Of 1014 the battle was set up. A hosting by Brian MacConnatic MacLurkin by the King of Ireland, and by Mael Shacknail MacDonald by the King of Tara to Dublin. All the Leinster men were assembled against them, and the foreigners of Dublin, and a like number of foreigners Loch Lane, along with them, 1,000 breastplates. A valiant battle was fought between them, the like which was never before encountered. Annals of Ulster. Does that sound like a simple battle for Dublin? It most certainly does not, because the warriors who came ashore would not stop with the city walls. They would swipe what they could, and continue bringing in forces behind them and settle and create more and more issues for the native Gaels. The actual battle itself was a horrid affair. Thousands of warriors would perish north of Dublin in the Bay area, which looks a lot different today than it did then. Brian's expertise and tactics won the day because he understood the lay of the land and kept his army positioned in such a way that the invading forces backed up by Dublin's men were drawn by an oncoming tide that they missed to notice due to their fighting full on from the front. It came in right behind them. Brian knew this. He had camped in the region many times and studied the land. This was the last bastion of Viking Ireland they had to be completely conquered and incorporated into the greater vision for the country. But of course Sihtric didn't see it that way. But he witnessed from inside the walls the slaughter of his army, but he himself survived. Sadly, Brian did not survive the day. He won the battle, but in a cruel twist of fate fell to Broder's axe in his tent and died. But they had already won the Battle of Clontarf, effectively ending the Viking Second Age of Ireland. The Vikings never conquered Ireland, and thus this was the climax, the battle for Ireland. In that moment Brian must have known, Vikings in chainmail. There was no time to think any further, no time to assess and plan, only to act. As Broder burst into his tent, Brian reached for his sword. Morgan Llewellyn's Brian Boru and the battle for Ireland. Here comes the counter-arguments. Brian Boru, the power-hungry usurper. Brian Boru is often characterized as a power-hungry usurper and not a traditional high king in the classical sense. For many centuries the O'Neills held supremacy over the provincial kings, meaning the ceremonial high kingship was just passed around between the northern and southern O'Neills. Brian Boru is often quoted as having personal ambition due to his actions, which saw him campaigning around the whole of Ireland, subjugating the kings and in their minds forcing their hands, due to a personal vendetta. The idea of a unified Ireland under one rule wasn't something that was conceived at that time. And lastly, Brian imposed old traditional tributes in the Book of Rights as High King of Ireland, and following on that point, Brian is seen as using and manipulating the church to his own advantage, especially through using familial connections such as his brother Markin becoming a very powerful bishop in Ireland. Brian also ensured the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland in Armagh, in the heartland of the north, viewed and honoured him as the Emperor of the Gael, not just as High King. Of course, all of these points on the surface can be viewed as selfish, personally motivated, and actions of a tyrant. To refute those points, Brian Boru viewed the ceremonial aspect of high kingship as completely ineffective in maintaining the protection of the whole island. This is paramount in the fact that the Vikings had built up tremendous power bases mainly in the south, which of course was of no major concern to the O'Neills, for they were based in the north. If left unchecked for many more decades, their power would have increased and dominated the southern half of Ireland, and eventually would have potentially taken the high kingship for themselves. Brian stopped this by defeating and subjugating each Viking power base individually. The only time that he slaughtered any Viking family was early in his career, the Ivar family of Limerick, because they had their part in killing his brother Mahon. After this, he made deals and alliances with Ivar of Waterford and tried to reason with Sihtric Silkbeard many times in Dublin. He wasn't a tyrant, he was a leader with a plan. The O'Neill supporters called Brian selfish, yet they were the ones that held onto the high kingship for 600 years. Should it not go to the most capable person to lead the country and the best leader? Their selfishness and short-sightedness couldn't see past their greed and lack of overall awareness of what was happening in the country, because it wasn't taking place on their own doorstep. Brian and his clan, the Dalcassians, once they got powerful enough, took care of this mess in the south, and then took the north to try to act as one unit, as one island. This is more apparent when you get to know the history. Flappertak of the North rebelled many times against Brian, but Brian did not kill him. In the end, he married his daughter to him. The same with Sihtric. He wanted to build alliances and create an Irish army like the Fianna of old. And the closest he got to that was an army that fought for him in the Battle of Clontarf and won and saved Ireland. Brian's tribute on the provincial kings was an old traditional tribute in the Book of Rights. Brian was mainly concerned with reconstructing the country, starting with Munster. This would have undoubtedly spread throughout the rest of the country if we worked as one unit. So Brian was not a tyrant nor a dictator. He was a capable leader and patriot who wanted to create something new and fresh for the country. The fact that his life and career changed Ireland forever in many ways is a testament to his achievement. The Battle of Clontarf, often portrayed as a monumental clash that determined the fate of Ireland, is an overblown event in historical narratives. While it was indeed a significant battle, its scope and implications have been magnified beyond their true extent. Firstly, the battle was primarily a contest for control over Dublin, a significant trading city, rather than a grand struggle for the entirety of Ireland. Under Viking influence, Dublin was a prize worth fighting for, but the conflict was more about local dominance than national sovereignty. Secondly, the portrayal of the battle as a heroic stand of the Irish against foreign invaders needs to be more accurate. The forces on both sides were a mix of native Irish and Norsemen. Brian Boru's army included Viking allies, and the defenders of Dublin had Irishmen in their ranks. This blurs the narrative of a clear-cut clash between native Irish and foreign Vikings. In conclusion, while the Battle of Clontarf was undoubtedly significant in its immediate context, its portrayal as a defining moment for Ireland's fate against foreign invaders is oversimplified. It was a battle for regional dominance with complexities that defy the grand narratives often associated with it. The Battle of Clontarf was a defining moment for Ireland. It wasn't just a skirmish for control over Dublin, but a pivotal moment in Irish history that had lasting implications for the island's political landscape and cultural memory. There were national stakes involved. Dublin was indeed the immediate prize. The battle stakes extended far beyond the city walls though. Brian Boru's ambition was to solidify his claim as the High King of all Ireland. A victory at Clontarf would secure Dublin and reinforce his authority over the entire Ireland, uniting various factions under a single leadership. The Vikings had been raiding and settling in Ireland for over 2 centuries by the time of the Battle of Clontarf. Their influence was not limited to Dublin. They had established settlements in Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick. The battle represented a broader Irish resistance against Norse influence. A victory against the Vikings in Dublin would symbolise the decline in Norse power throughout Ireland, which indeed it was. The battle indeed saw a mix of Irish and Norse on both sides. However, this complexity underscores the national implications of the conflict. The alliances formed for the Battle of Clontarf were not just local arrangements, but were representative of broader political dynamics in Ireland. Leaders from various parts of Ireland and from different backgrounds chose sides in the battle, indicating its significance for the island. The so-called Vikings on Brian's side were pretty Irish by this point. The port of Limerick and Waterford had been there for over 2 centuries. The new invading forces garnered by Citrix signified a fresh invading threat and was a fresh attempt to seize power of an essential region around Dublin, North Leinster and Meath. If Boru lost, then the other Viking ports could have been forced to change alliances again, leading to an overthrow of the kings, provincial kings and the High King. The aftermath of the Battle of Clontarf had national repercussions. With the death of Brian Boru and many regional leaders, a power vacuum emerged, leading to a reshuffling of power dynamics across Ireland. The battle's legacy was felt for generations, influencing political alliances, territorial claims, and even the cultural memory of Irish people. The Battle of Clontarf is revered in Irish folklore and historical consciousness. Its commemoration over the centuries, including stories, song, and art, indicates that it was not viewed merely as a regional conflict, but as a defining moment for the Irish nation. In conclusion, the Battle of Clontarf was far more than a battle for Dublin. It was a watershed moment in Irish history, with national stakes, symbolic significance against Viking influence, and lasting implications for Ireland's political cultural landscape. My arguments have been made. I am a big fan and lover of Brian Boru, and his vibrancy and the inspirational life he led. I see in the character a true patriot, sick to death of the status quo, and seeing an opportunity to lead his people into a new era of his country. Modern political ideologies do not fit this situation. What simply happened was the death of his family through the machinations of traitors, cowards, and power-hungry invading forces, which filled his soul with rage, passion, and fire for a new dawn, which he almost achieved entirely. He achieved more than what the Anglo-Saxons were ever capable of doing. He continued the streak for the Gaelic nation of stopping foreign conquerors, and he lives on in the memory of Irish people until this day. Brian Boru was a true hero and my favourite person from all of history. But the days of Ireland's glory were departed. In the words of his eulogists, Brian was the last man in Éireann who was a match for 100. He was the last man who killed 100 in one day. His was the last step that true valour ever took in Éireann. Seamus McManus, The Story of the Irish Race. Of all those who fought and died on Good Friday in Ireland, only Brian Boru would be honoured subsequent generations as a great hero. Mythology aside, from his actions it is apparent that he was different from most men of his time, as were Caesar and Charlemagne from the men of theirs. Morgan Llewellyn, Brian Boru, and the Battle for Ireland. Brian Boruma, anglicised as Boru, is one of the most intriguing figures from Irish history, and, although plenty of legend has accrued to him, he is remembered as the single Irish king to most successfully unite the island of Ireland. Sean Duffy, Brian Boru, and the Battle of Clontarf.
Thank you so much for watching the whole video. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and you will get more of this content to you directly. If you feel like it and you want to contribute to me creating more content for you, make sure you check out my links. You can find a PayPal link there. You can contribute one time to me. Even better, for you to get more value, more content, you can join my Patreon. The link is in the description as well. Also, you can find me across all social media. I'm on all the major platforms. All the links are in the description.